Thank you, Bishop, and good morning, everyone. I suspect that for most of you, this jubilant proclamation of glee wasn't your first reaction when you heard that it was time to deal with the budget. During the break, I took a quick look through the visitor registration list for this assembly. Fortunately, I was successful in finding someone who identifies with this expression of jubilation when discussing budgets. Welcome, Bernie Sanders. You never know where Bernie and his mittens are going to turn up. Before getting into some of the numbers, let's get a better understanding of what budgeting is all about, starting with the family budget. Author Sally Poplin observes that some couples go over their budgets very carefully every month. Others just go over them. If that definition isn't very helpful, we can turn to author William Feather, who said, "A budget tells us what we can't afford, but it doesn't keep us from buying it." Perhaps the most unhelpful quote of all is one by former US President George W. Bush, who said, "It's clearly a budget. It's got a lot of numbers in it." Now let's move to a couple of definitions that might be more helpful, such as American personal finance guru Dave Ramsey. A budget is telling your money where to go instead of where it went. And then there's my favorite from former US President Barack Obama. A budget is more than just a series of numbers on a page. It's an embodiment of our values. Barack Obama's thoughts are especially relevant when we think about our congregational budgets and today our synodical budgets. As I mentioned yesterday, given the challenging times that we're currently facing, even more care than usual went into the preparation of the budgets that I'll be presenting to you shortly. This involved collecting input from and reviewing proposals with a wide number of leaders and other stakeholders from across the Synod to ensure that as many views about what is important and what is less important were represented. The process to build a better budget started last fall, when Synod Council members held a working session over Zoom to develop high-level budgetary principles, to suggest those ministry areas that should be considered for new or additional funding, and to identify areas of lesser impact where it might be possible to consider funding reductions. The deans, representing each of the 17 different geographic areas across the Synod, were also invited to provide their input. This past March, the 4 synodical officers, along with Synod office staff, met on several occasions to assess all of the ideas that were generated, to review historical spending patterns, and to finalize budgetary principles and assumptions that can be used as a foundation for developing budgets over the next triennium. Next, Kim Marcy, our Director of Finance and Administration, and I took the output from these sessions and created draft versions of budgets for 2021 to 2024. These drafts were subsequently reviewed by Synod Council's Finance Committee prior to being finalized and approved by the entire Synod Council. The final step of this budgetary process is for you, the delegates of this Assembly 2021, to receive, discuss, possibly amend, and adopt Synod Council's recommendations. That's our agenda for the next 30 minutes or so. It's difficult to develop a budget without agreeing to some underlying principles and assumptions. First, 3 of the most significant assumptions around income. Looking into the future, we're anticipating that total congregational benevolence offerings received from congregations will decrease by 2% each year, using 2020 actual benevolence receipts as the base. This decrease is anticipated not because we're asking or expecting each congregation to give less. In fact, we're hoping and expecting that many congregations will be able to give the same, and that some will be able to give more. Rather, we anticipate a 2% decrease overall, recognizing that several congregations that have faithfully remitted benevolence offerings over many years have closed over the last couple of years, and that unfortunately, others will likely face similar difficult decisions over the next few years. The second assumption is that the Synod will be eligible for and apply for the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy in 2021. Our third assumption around income is that the Evangelical Lutheran Foundation of Eastern Canada, or ELFEC for short, will realize a 5% rate of return each year, consistent with their investment policy and strategy. Speaking of investments, that reminds me of another quote by William Feather, who said, "One of the funny things about the stock market is that every time one person buys, another sells, and both think they are astute." Now let's move on to several assumptions about expenditures. The first assumption may be obvious, but it's worthwhile stating. Our decisions around budgeted expenditures will be consistent with the Synod's strategic plan. Secondly, these budgets assume a 2.5% annual rate of inflation. This comes into play when we look at areas such as changes to staff compensation. And thirdly, a goal that we've had in place for a number of years now. Our Synod benevolence to the National Church will be no less than 25% of the benevolence offerings that we receive from congregations. And finally, a few general assumptions. The first of these, we need to be fiscally responsible and strive for balanced budgets. Secondly, unlike recent years when donations to the Bishop's Company Fund have supported several existing budget items, going forward, these donations will be used to fund new ministry opportunities. Thirdly, the intention is that all income earned by invested funds will be spent the following year, rather than accumulating, thus maximizing the opportunities for ministry. In conjunction with the previous assumption, Assumption 4 suggests that in most cases, unless otherwise specified, the principle of our large undesignated gifts and bequests will be retained so that it generates income for future years. And finally, in the unexpected event of a significant annual surplus that is more than budgeted, consistent with our practices for a number of years now, the surplus will be allocated as follows. 50% will be remitted as additional benevolence to the ELCIC, and 50% will be transferred to ELFEC's General Investment Fund for reinvestment to increase income in future years. Let's see now how these principles and assumptions play out. Yesterday, when I summarized the Synod's financial highlights over the past 3-year period, I did so under the framework of our 4 strategic goals. I'd like to use this same framework to summarize the budgets for the next few years. For each goal, I'll start with a quick reminder about some of the ministries that are included in that area. List those ministries that are the largest in terms of budget dollars, and identify those areas where the budget allocation that's being proposed deviates significantly from previous years. We have 4 years of budgets to review and adopt this morning. First, a number of revisions the Synod Council made to the original 2021 budget that was developed 3 years ago, and then proposed budgets for 2022, 2023, and 2024 to take us to the point when we gather again in 3 years' time as an assembly. Other than a few exceptions that I'll point out along the way, the budgets that are being recommended for all of these years are quite similar in nature. Rather than talk about each of these separately, I'll use 2022 as a representative of these 4 years and use the original 2021 budget that we approved 3 years ago as the baseline for comparison purposes. I'll lead you through a high-level walkthrough of Synod Council's recommendations, but if you're interested in the details, I would refer you to Section 8 of the Bulletin of Reports, starting on page 30, carrying through to page 35. With reference to the actual budget details that start on page 8-30, you'll notice 3 columns under each year. For example, the 2021 revised budget. The first column is labeled Level 1 Funding. This refers to funding that is unrestricted, funding that has no strings attached. The second column, Restricted Funding, consists primarily of funding that must be used for specific purposes. For example, a designated bequest. And of course, the total column is the sum of the previous two. So let's start focusing first on expenditures, or in other words, the various synodical ministries that we're proposing to fund. Using 2022 as our representative year, 30% of our expenditures are allocated to the Synod's first strategic goal: provide vision, leadership, and support to the synodical community, the blue piece of the pie. If you remember from my presentation yesterday, this includes ministries such as advocating for social justice, supporting our Synod's outdoor ministry programs, providing grants to congregations to support outreach projects and ministry to children, youth, and young adults, advising congregations that are interested in exploring options for their church property, providing resources to congregations, not only in the normal times, but pivoting quickly during unprecedented times, and being present with congregations, not only for the celebrations, but also in working through congregational challenges. The largest chunk of funding in this section of the pie is allocated to the Mission Committee. Almost $200,000 is projected for 2022. That is expected to provide funding for 30 to 40 grants to congregations for their mission outreach projects. The next largest allocation, over $120,000, is earmarked for congregational redevelopment. Services that the Synod makes available to congregations that have potential to redevelop their property to extend their mission to the community, and at the same time, perhaps extend their financial sustainability as a congregation. The third largest portion of funding, $90,000, supports youth and young adult ministries, including the 2 camps, student ministry on university campuses, and grants to congregations in support of their ministry to children, youth, and young adults. In terms of comparing the recommended budget for 2022 against the budgets that we have adopted in previous years, the $121,000 for congregational redevelopment services is new funding. For now, funding for the Mission Committee shows a $92,000 reduction. However, more funding is available and can be allocated to this area as additional congregational and other viable initiatives requiring grants are identified. The $8,000 increase to funding for public policy and service was one of the priorities identified through Synod Council's review and will be allocated to support work in the areas of racial justice, Indigenous reconciliation, and a new climate justice initiative. A further increase from the $8,000 here to $10,000 has been budgeted for each of 2023 and 2024. This brings us to our second strategic goal, 26% of our budget, $614,000, to develop capable leaders, the orange area. As a quick reminder, this area of the budget provides funding for Martin Luther University College to develop not only the rostered leaders for our church, but other leaders for our communities. Bursaries for seminary students like Bethan, and funding for congregational internship placements. A variety of continuing education events for rostered leaders, as well as specialized training events and workshops for church council members, treasurers, and other lay leaders, combined with timely communications that hopefully make the work for these congregational volunteer leaders a bit easier. As you will see, the largest area of expenditure in this area of the budget is our annual grant of $280,000 to Martin Luther University College. You heard about some of their ministries yesterday afternoon. Next next largest is the funding that we provide to the Candidacy Committee, almost all of which is allocated for bursaries to seminary students, along with internship support. Recognizing that in this day and age, most congregations are unable to fund the cost of supporting an intern, as had been the previous expectation. And thirdly, a $23,000 budget line for ministry area support that includes grants for ministry area initiatives, training for deans, and an in-person dean meeting. What's changed over the last few years? The $12,000 increase for candidacy will provide increased financial support for bursaries and internships. The $10,000 decrease for the ministry areas results from one of the learnings arising out of the pandemic. Although some in-person meetings are important, the deans agreed that they could replace one of their 2 annual in-person meetings with a virtual meeting. Next, Goal 3, representing 27% or $642,000. Connect the Synod community with the wider church through effective partnerships. This purple area includes funding that we provide either directly or indirectly to our many partners, especially the National Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. Funding that enables us to continue to walk with and deepen our relationships with our 2 global mission companions, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Guyana and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. And funding that in 2022 will include paying the registration fee for our 53 delegates to the National Church's Triennial Convention in Calgary. By far, the largest single outlay in this area is our synodical benevolence to the ELCIC National Church, $406,700 for 2022, representing almost 32% of the benevolence offerings that we anticipate receiving from congregations, well above our 25% minimum goal. Because we expect the congregational benevolence offerings will continue to decline somewhat, the actual dollar amounts that have been budgeted for 2022 through 2024 will be held at the 2021 level, rather than increasing annually as has been our practice with our ELCIC benevolence for many years now. The other large item in this area is $60,000 for delegate registration fees to the 2022 National Convention, a cost that, effective with the 2017 convention, shifted from a congregational to a synodical responsibility. Obviously, with a national convention occurring only every 3 years, this expenditure won't be required in any of the other years that are in scope for these budget recommendations. But it is an unusual item for 2022. Fourthly, and finally, Goal 4, live as a healthy synod, requiring $392,000 or 17% of our total budget for 2022. As I go through some of the items that are included in this, the green colored area of the budget, I'm also including some of the costs that are shared across all 4 of these goals. When we think of a healthy synod and these shared costs, collectively, these include costs that are incurred for items such as our communication tools, meeting every 3 years for our Synod Assembly, the regular meetings of Synod Council, our office staff, and our professional staff. Of course, we also need adequate office space, technology support, professional services, and office supplies. I've listed the 5 largest areas of expenditure that help us achieve our goal of living as a healthy synod. Keep in mind that portions of costs associated with compensation and office expenditures also apply to the other 3 goals. Salaries and benefits, including travel expenses, a total of $774,000, provide for 7.5 employees, honoraria payments for 2 of the officer positions, as well as the fees and travel expenses for occasional services that are provided by the deans of the 17 ministry areas. As with all of our other expenses, our compensation system is carefully managed while ensuring that employees are compensated fairly. I think it's very important for us to realize that the $774,000 is not simply an administrative expense. Our Synod staff play a critical role in translating the visions and goals to which we aspire as a Synod into the fulfillment of that vision. These are also the people who are on the ground delivering services to congregations and to congregational leaders, whether that be face-to-face or behind the scenes. Second on this list is office expenses. You may be surprised to know that all of the costs of operating the Synod office have already been paid for. This is made possible through the income that the Synod earns each year on some of those invested funds that were generously donated by our parents and grandparents many years ago. As a result, the offerings that your congregation gives to benevolence are not used to pay utility bills, to maintain the Synod office building, to purchase office equipment, office supplies, insurance, or to pay other expenses that are necessary to keep the office running. Rather, I think we should all be excited to know that benevolence offerings are allocated in direct support of on-the-ground ministries in response to our call to be a Synod in mission for others. Thirdly, $73,000 provides a premium subsidy to those retired pastors and spouses who are grandfathered under our previous retiree health insurance plan that is no longer in effect. You'll see the other two areas, stewardship and resource development, and communication, account for $41,000 and $18,700 respectively. An expenditure that won't occur in 2022, but that will be required in 2024, is $155,000 for Synod Assembly. In anticipation of the delegates to Assembly 2024 electing a new bishop, the 2024 budget includes a $20,000 provision for moving and relocation costs. You will notice that the budgeted costs for salaries, benefits, and travel are $39,000 lower than what we budgeted 3 years ago. That's attributable to several factors, including a slightly reduced total headcount, changes to the structure and cost of the benefit plan, and a slight reduction in staff travel, given our learnings during the pandemic that some meetings can be held quite effectively over Zoom. It's important that I pause here for a minute and mention that one of the unfortunate budget reductions, starting in 2022, is the elimination of the Women's Ministry Director and the Worship Ministry Director positions, roles that have each been equivalent to about 10 hours a month. It goes without saying that any reductions, especially when they directly affect people, are always difficult decisions to make and are not made without considerable thought and discussion, not only to assess the impact on those ministries in the future, but in this case, in respect of the two incumbents, both of whom have been providing meaningful leadership for these ministries. The reduction in office expenses represents the expectation that we'll be able to continue to identify and implement further efficiencies. And finally, a reduction in our synodical contribution toward the National Church's Canada Lutheran magazine. A decrease from $20,000 to $10,000 per year will be phased in between 2022 and 2024. Some advanced consultation has taken place with the appropriate individuals at the National Church Office about this reduction. This brings us to the end of the expenditure section. In summary, if we combine funding for the ministries that are included under Goal 1, Goal 2, Goal 3, and Goal 4, we end up with a 2022 budget for synodical ministries totaling $2,365,000. The obvious question is, how do we plan to fund this budget? Our projected income for 2022 consists of 4 sources of unrestricted funding that can be used for any purpose. In addition, the rose-colored row represents funding from a variety of restricted or designated funds. Of these sources, congregational benevolence offerings account for almost $1.3 million, more than half of the budget. As I mentioned previously, we're anticipating that these offerings will decline by 2% each year as some congregations close. The LFAC Operations Grant, investment income that we received from the funds that were invested in 1973 from the sale of Waterloo Lutheran University to the province of Ontario, is projected at $215,000. Similarly, investment income earned from the undesignated gift and bequest fund and the Remembering for the Future fund account for $240,000 in total. In addition to these unrestricted funding sources, we have budgeted $640,000 of funding from restricted funds. This includes funding such as the grants that we receive from the National Church, as well as income from designated bequests and other gifts invested with LFAC. For 2021, this other funding will also include funding from the federal government's Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program. As was the case on the expenditure side, there are also some significant changes when we compare the income that we had projected 3 years ago when developing the 2021 original budget to the income that we are now projecting for 2022. Benevolence is showing a decrease of over $100,000 due to a somewhat steeper decline than what was projected 3 years ago. For the most part, the changes to our other funding sources net each other out. For 2022, after accounting for budgeted income and expenditures, the bottom line is a small surplus of almost $5,000. For the other years, you'll see a projected surplus of $187,000 for 2021, largely attributable to the subsidies that we anticipate receiving from the federal government's wage subsidy program, a small deficit of $4,000 in 2023, and a deficit of $62,000 in 2024. Our plan is to apply a portion of the surplus that we anticipate banking in 2021 to the deficit in 2024, thus making 2024 a break-even year. With this background information, as Barack Obama would say, it's time to see where our values as a synod lie by discussing and voting on Synod Council's recommendations. Synod Council recommends that the 2021 revised budget and the 2022 to 2024 proposed budgets be adopted. Bishop, I'll turn things back over to you at this point to lead any discussion and conduct the vote.